When the storm clouds gathered that winter, Eli Stoltzfus knew what was coming. And it wasn't just the snow. His barn, built with the finest craftsmanship, would soon face the worst season in memory. But what his neighbors saw as a foolish and wasteful effort, a useless drain channel, would soon prove to be the difference between life and ruin. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of perseverance, faith, and the simple wisdom of the Amish touch your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. Eli Stoltzfus spent most of his days in the small shop he had built beside his family's home. The rhythmic sound of the saw cutting through the oak was as familiar to him as the low hum of his horse-drawn buggy on a quiet Sunday morning. Yet, as the days grew shorter and the cold wind of late autumn swept through the narrow valley, Eli found himself troubled by a premonition. For generations, the Stoltzfus family had worked the land with simplicity, their barns solid and their homes humble. But this winter, it felt different. The weather was already colder than usual, and the ground had become thick with frost even before November had arrived. Eli could feel the earth beneath him harden with each passing day, as if the very soil was bracing for something worse. By the time the first heavy snow fell, Eli had already begun the project he had quietly thought of for months, a drainage channel around his barn. To the others in the community, it seemed an unnecessary expense. Winter was harsh, but this was not a spring flood that needed careful management. His neighbors shook their heads when they saw him working on it. "Wasteful," they muttered. "The ground will freeze hard enough to prevent rot." But Eli knew something they did not. His barn was built well, but the land around it had a problem. The area was naturally low-lying, and come spring, the snowmelt would flood the ground. Without proper drainage, the barn's foundation, which had served his family faithfully for years, would soften and sink, causing damage that would take years to fix. A simple drain channel, cut by hand, carved with care, would redirect the water safely away from the barn's wooden foundation. It wasn't an extravagant idea, just a sensible one. But as his shovel bit into the earth, the quiet thought echoed in his mind. Sometimes the smallest effort can prevent the biggest mistake. The first storm hit at dusk, a swirl of gray clouds that turned the evening sky to steel. By morning, the valley was submerged in white, the fields and fences erased beneath 3 feet of snow. Eli rose early, the winter chill biting at the air inside his small home, his breath misting in the dim candlelight. The others in the community rushed to secure their barns, covering haystacks and fastening doors against the cold. But Eli didn't hurry. He had already done what needed to be done. His barn was prepared, the drain channel ready to carry away any meltwater that would come in the spring. Still, the storm was brutal. The snow piled high, and the winds howled so loudly that the trees bent under its force. Eli knew that the channel alone wouldn't stop the worst of the storm. It wasn't the snow or the cold he feared, but the long days that followed. The wet, soggy weeks that always came in the heart of winter were the most treacherous. As he looked out over the white expanse, Eli could almost hear the voices of his neighbors. "He's foolish," they'd say. "Why spend time on something that won't matter?" But Eli didn't care for the opinions of others. He trusted the quiet wisdom that had been passed down through his family for generations. He trusted that his hands, guided by a deep faith and knowledge of the land, had done what was necessary. It wasn't the loud storms or the sharp winds that tested the heart of a man, Eli thought, as he closed the door and went to work on his tools. It was the patience to endure the quiet before the thaw, when the land would soften and the waters would come. He knew that it was always the quiet moments, the unsung efforts, that truly determined whether a man's work would stand the test of time. As the days passed and the cold gripped the valley, Eli's barn stood firm against the elements. The wind, biting and relentless, swept across the land, piling snow in ever higher drifts against the thick stone foundation of the barn. Inside, Eli worked by the flickering glow of an oil lamp, his hands steady and sure. There was always something to be done, always another task to finish, whether it was mending a harness, sharpening tools, or tending to the woodpile. His work never stopped, for the days were long and the nights came early. But through all the mundane chores, a constant unease tugged at Eli's thoughts. The snowstorm that had come in early October was only the beginning. Each storm that followed seemed to bring more snow, more wind, and deeper cold. His neighbors' barns, hastily built and quickly finished, stood less well against the winter. While they had mocked Eli for his excessive work, there was an undeniable tension in the air. It wasn't just the cold, it was the weight of what was to come. Eli had spent most of his life on the land, learning from his father and his father's father. They had taught him the rhythms of the seasons, the way the earth behaved, how the land could be trusted to reveal its secrets. He knew when to plant, when to harvest, and when to wait. This winter, Eli found himself waiting, but not for the thaw. No, he was waiting for the slow, quiet disaster that would reveal itself in the coming months. The thaw would come, yes, and with it the snow melt would arrive, filling every low-lying field, flooding barns, and softening foundations. His drain channel, which his neighbors had scorned, would prove its worth then. Eli had done what was needed, but he knew it would not be enough. The storms were not just tests of a barn's construction, but tests of patience, of fortitude. And Eli had learned long ago that patience, when practiced in the quiet moments, would always yield the most powerful rewards. The first sign that the thaw had come was not the softening of the ground, but the distant sound of rushing water. It came in the early morning hours when the sun was just beginning to stir behind the hills. Eli was awake long before the rooster crowed, and he stood at the window of his cabin, watching the snowmelt trickle down the slopes like a river of ice and time. The other farmers had already risen to check their barns, but Eli took his time. He knew the land well, and he had learned the slow art of watching, of listening to what the earth told him. The snow was melting faster than it had in years, and with it, the rivers and streams were swelling beyond their banks. He could hear the rushing sound from his window, the water racing toward the fields. With a quiet prayer, Eli walked outside, his boots crunching through the thawing snow. He approached his barn, the drain channel already beginning to do its work. He had built the channel with care, positioning it at just the right angle, ensuring that the water would flow away from the foundation and into the field below. The stones that lined the channel helped guide the water, and the sawdust he had packed between the walls had done its job, keeping the ground around the barn firm. As he knelt down to inspect, Eli's heart swelled with gratitude. The channel was working perfectly, the water flowing smoothly through the stones and away from the barn's base. The work he had done months ago, the work that had seemed so useless to his neighbors, had paid off. He glanced to his right where the neighboring farms lay. Their barns, hastily constructed with single walls and no forethought for drainage, were beginning to show signs of damage. The water had nowhere to go but into the earth, and as it soaked into the ground, their barns began to soften. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of the wet earth, and Eli could see faint cracks forming along the walls. The weight of the snowmelt was taking its toll. But Eli remained calm. He had built his barn with more than just the winter in mind. He had built it for the long years ahead, for the quiet seasons that tested a man's resolve. As the water flowed around his barn, he closed his eyes and offered thanks. His neighbors had laughed at his efforts, but it was no longer a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. When the rest of the men came to Eli's barn, their eyes wide with disbelief, he didn't boast. He simply nodded, silently acknowledging the truth that had become evident. His work had stood the test of the thaw, and it would stand through the seasons yet to come. As the days warmed and the thaw continued its steady march across the valley, Eli Stoltzfus took comfort in the sound of the rushing water, now gently flowing away from his barn. The work of the previous fall had paid off, and though the land was softening, the foundation of his barn remained firm, protected by the quiet channel he had carved with his hands. The heavy rains that came with the late spring melt would now pass around him, flowing harmlessly down the sloping land and into the creek below. It wasn't long, however, before word spread through the community. Neighbors, once dismissive of Eli's work, began to visit his farm. They came one by one, some cautious, some embarrassed, but all with the same question in their hearts. How did you know? How did he know that the storms would be this harsh? How did he know that the snow would come early and the rains would follow? One by one, the farmers who had laughed at him stood outside his barn, their eyes drawn to the smooth stone channel, the carefully constructed path that had guided the water so effortlessly away from Eli's foundation. They could see with quiet humility that their own barns had not fared as well. Some had already begun to show signs of rot, while others sat in puddles of water, their wood softened by the unrelenting weight of the thaw. It was in these moments, in the quiet presence of his neighbors, that Eli understood the real power of faith, not just the kind that came from God, but the kind that grew when a man stood firm in his beliefs, even when no one else could see the value. It was late one afternoon when Peter Johnson, a neighbor who had suffered the worst of the winter storms, came to Eli's door. Peter had been one of the first to mock Eli's cautiousness, but now, standing before him, he had the humility to admit that he had been wrong. His own barn, built in a rush with little care for the future, had suffered the most. The floor had softened, the foundation had shifted, and Peter feared it would collapse by summer. I didn't think it would come to this, Peter said, his voice heavy with regret. You were right, Eli. I should have taken more time. I should have built for the worst. Eli didn't respond with words of triumph. Instead, he simply nodded and offered a quiet smile. We're all just doing our best, he said. Sometimes the best isn't always obvious, but we keep going. Peter's eyes flickered with recognition, and he asked, How much firewood do you have left? Enough, Eli replied, with a simple honesty that carried more weight than the response suggested. From that moment on, Eli became the quiet teacher, not by force but by example. He helped his neighbors repair their barns, offering his knowledge about drainage, construction, and the small things that could make all the difference in the long run. The once derided drain channel had become the symbol of wisdom, patience, and survival. And though Eli never sought recognition, it was clear that his small, humble decision to prepare for the worst had set a new standard in the community. Years passed, and the seasons continued their unbroken rhythm. Eli Stoltzfus's barn stood strong through each winter that followed, each storm that came and went, while the small drain channel, carved from the earth, remained a testament to the quiet wisdom of his hands. As the community grew and new families arrived, they sought out Eli not just for his barn-building expertise, but for the life lessons he had quietly taught. Eli never spoke much of the past, and he never boasted of his foresight. His life was one of simplicity, of doing the work that needed doing, and trusting in the land to show him the way. But as the years unfolded, those who had once dismissed his careful planning began to see the value in the quiet choices he had made. Eli had built for the worst, and the worst had never come. Still, it was in the steady, unremarkable presence of his work that the truth was revealed. Sometimes the simplest decisions, made with the quiet confidence of knowing what needs to be done, can outlast even the harshest winters. One summer, when Eli was much older, his son Abram took over the family farm. Abram had watched his father for years, learning the art of carpentry, the rhythms of the seasons, and the importance of a solid foundation, both in the earth and in life. As Eli stood outside his barn, watching Abram fix the roof with the same steady hands that Eli had once used, he realized that the legacy of the land wasn't just in the buildings they constructed, but in the values they passed down. Eli's eyes grew heavy with the weight of years, but there was peace in his heart as he looked at the work of his hands, the barn still standing firm and proud. His life, so rooted in simplicity, had been enough. The drain channel, the barn, the quiet lessons of faith, these would live on long after the storm clouds had passed. The legacy was not in the structures themselves, but in the choices made to build them. Eli had built not just for survival, but for a future that would carry forward his belief in patience, wisdom, and the enduring strength of the land. And as his son knelt beside him, silently offering thanks for the legacy of those quiet, steady years, Eli knew that the land and the lessons he had passed down would continue to stand firm long after he was gone. The seasons moved on as they always did, and the land settled into a familiar rhythm. The long summers came with their blazing sun and the smell of freshly cut hay. The fall brought cooler winds and the gathering of crops. Winter's early warning was always the same, with the first chill that crept into the bones before the snow came to stay. And in each season, Eli Stoltzfus worked with the same steady hand, his attention always to the details others had overlooked. It was a mild winter when Eli's youngest daughter, Sarah, came to him with a question that had been weighing on her heart. "Papa," she began as they sat by the fire one evening, the smell of bread baking in the oven, "do you ever regret the things you've done?" Eli looked at her, his weathered face softening. He had always believed that the quiet work of his hands spoke louder than any words. But there were moments like this one when words were necessary, moments when reflection was just as important as action. "Regret?" Eli mused, running a hand through his beard. "There's always something, isn't there? Something you wish you could have done differently. But when I look at this land, the work of my hands, I don't feel regret. I feel grateful. I built what needed building. That's all I could do." Sarah, who had always been eager to ask questions, was quiet for a long time. Finally she asked, "But what if others don't understand? What if they think you were wrong?" Eli smiled gently, a warmth in his eyes. "They'll always think something. That's the way of the world. But in the end, it's the land that tells the truth. It doesn't care about others' opinions. It just cares about the work. Whether you're building a barn or planting a seed, it's your hands, your effort that counts. If you know what's right, then trust in that. Even when the storms come, you'll stand firm, and that's all any of us can do." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Sarah nodded, comforted by her father's words. There was a quiet wisdom in his gaze, a patience that had come not from books or teachings, but from years spent learning the land. For all the seasons she had known him, this was the lesson she needed to hear. And so, as winter turned to spring, Eli found himself reflecting not on what others thought, but on what had been accomplished. His barn still stood, his family was healthy, and the land, though worn by the seasons, had always given back what was needed. There was no room for regret, only quiet gratitude. As the years wore on, Eli Stoltzfus found himself slowing down. His hands, once as steady as the oak he worked with, now trembled with the weight of age. The land had become less familiar to him, not in the way it had once been, where every furrow in the earth and every curve in the stream spoke to him. No, it was something deeper, something unspoken that had settled into the lines of his face. But Eli never stopped working. There were still barns to mend, still fences to build, still simple tasks that gave him purpose. His daughter Sarah had taken over the majority of the work, and Abram, now a young man, had grown into the kind of farmer Eli had always hoped he would be. Yet Eli's hands still worked, guided by years of experience and knowledge that had become second nature to him. One December, as the first snow of the season fell gently across the land, Eli stood in the barn he had built so many years ago. The drain channel he had carved with his own hands was still in place, still carrying the water away, even though it had long since passed its test. He walked around the barn slowly, the soft crunch of snow under his boots, his mind quiet. He could feel the seasons shifting, feel the weight of time pressing in. Inside, the barn smelled of straw and wood, of the sweat and labor of many seasons. Abram had come in from the fields, and Sarah had already prepared the evening meal. There was a peace in the air, a quiet that could only come from years of hard work and faith. Eli's heart swelled with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do, not just for survival, but for something far greater, to leave behind a legacy of quiet wisdom, a legacy that would continue with his children, his grandchildren, and those who came after them. He had built for the worst, but he had also built with love, with care, and with a deep understanding of the land. And in the end, that was the most important thing. As the night grew colder, Eli took a seat by the fire, the warmth of the hearth filling the room. His family gathered around him, their faces lit by the flickering flames. He looked at them, feeling the quiet comfort of knowing they would carry on. The drain channel, the barn, the steady rhythms of his hands. They would live on, woven into the very fabric of their lives. This would be his final winter. And though he was growing tired, Eli Stoltzfus felt no fear. The work was done. His faith, his family, and the land had all stood the test of time. He had built something that would outlast him, something that would remain long after the seasons had come and gone. As the snow continued to fall outside, Eli smiled to himself, closing his eyes. He had lived a life well spent, and he knew it was enough. As the last of the snow melted from the fields and spring began its quiet return, Eli Stoltzfus could feel the weight of years heavier than ever. His once strong hands, weathered and worn from decades of hard work, now trembled when he held his tools. His back, once straight and unyielding, like the sturdy oaks he felled, now curved with the slow aches of age. The land, though still familiar, felt distant to him in a way it never had before. But despite the strain, Eli never stopped. He continued to walk the land every morning, as he always had, though now he leaned more heavily on his cane, his steps slower, more deliberate. The barn, standing firm against the passing years, was still his pride. The drain channel, once thought a foolish excess, had proven itself time and time again. Eli could feel it beneath his feet, the way the earth held steady, protected by the years of labor he had invested. That small act of foresight, that quiet decision to build with care, had paid off in ways no one could have predicted. It had protected not only his barn, but his family, his way of life. And now, as the years passed, Eli began to realize that the time had come for him to pass the torch. His son Abram, now a man with a family of his own, was ready to take the reins of the Stoltzfus farm. His hands were strong, his mind sharp, and his heart filled with the same quiet determination that Eli had carried for decades. Abram had been there from the start, watching his father build, learning with patience and precision. He understood the value of hard work, of humility, and most importantly, of building for the long haul. Eli had always known this day would come, but now that it was here, he found it harder than he had imagined to let go. The world had changed in small but significant ways. The fields around him were different, not in the crops they grew, but in the tools they used and the speed at which things moved. The old ways were still important, still grounding, still worth holding on to. But there was a new rhythm to the land now, one that Eli had seen in his son's eager steps, the way he worked with the land and not just on it. One warm spring afternoon, as they worked together in the barn, Abram turned to his father and asked, "Papa, do you think I'm ready?" Eli had always seen his son's potential, but hearing the question aloud, he realized how much Abram had already grown. His hands, though still young, held the same strength and care Eli had put into his own work. His quiet nature mirrored Eli's, but his mind was sharper, quicker to adapt to the changing world around him. Eli stopped what he was doing, his hands resting on the wooden beam of the barn. He looked at his son, his eyes soft but filled with a quiet understanding. "Ready?" he said. "I think you've been ready for a long time, Abram. The land will always test us, but you've always known what needs to be done. The work is never easy, but it's always worth it. I've seen you build with the same care I once did. The barn, the land, the family. They're all in good hands." A quiet smile spread across Abram's face as he nodded. He knew that his father wasn't just speaking about the work that lay before them. He was speaking of the spirit of the land, that quiet, enduring strength that came not from the size of one's tools or the speed of one's labor, but from the care and respect given to the earth beneath their feet. That evening, as the sun set low over the valley and the sounds of evening prayers drifted from the small house, Eli sat on the porch, his cane resting beside him. The air was cool, the sky clear. For the first time in many years, Eli felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He had lived a good life, a life filled with hard work, quiet faith, and deep love for the land and his family. The barn stood strong, the earth beneath it was steady, and his children were ready to carry on what he had started. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the evening wrap around him. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of the trees in the wind, the distant sound of Abram's voice as he spoke to Sarah. It was all so familiar, so comforting. This was what Eli had worked for, not just survival, but a legacy built on patience, foresight, and quiet wisdom. His time was nearly at an end, but the work would continue. Abram would take the land forward, and Eli's teachings would live on in every careful decision, every humble act of craftsmanship. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Eli whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. His hands had built something far more enduring than he had ever imagined, not just a barn, but a way of life that would continue for generations. Winter came once more, though this time it was not a season of hardship. The barn stood strong, as it had for so many winters, and the drain channel still worked as quietly as ever, carrying the runoff from the spring melt away from the foundation, protecting what had been built. Abram had taken the reins of the farm, his own work ethic, his own knowledge of the land, a continuation of his father's. The family's farm had grown, but it had done so slowly, carefully, and with respect for the lessons that had been passed down. Eli watched with pride as Abram worked the land with the same care and dedication he had. His son had built a new barn, larger than the old one, but just as carefully crafted. The walls were thicker, the foundation firmer, the roof better insulated. It was a reflection of the changes that had come to the world, yet it still held the same spirit as the original barn Eli had built all those years ago. As the years went by, Eli's health began to fail. His body, worn from decades of labor, could no longer keep up with the work. He would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching Abram and his grandchildren play in the yard, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. The land, though it had changed, was still the same. The seasons still passed, the storms still came, but Eli had built something that had withstood them all. His work, his faith, his quiet wisdom, they had all lived on, long after he had passed. One cold winter morning, Eli awoke to the sound of his family around him. He could feel the warmth of their presence, the comfort of their care. As Abram sat beside him, Eli's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he looked at his son with pride. "It's all yours now," Eli whispered softly. "Build for the worst, but live for the best." Those were the last words Eli spoke before he closed his eyes one final time. And though he had left the earth, his legacy lived on in the land he had tended, in the barn that still stood, in the work that would never cease. Eli Stoltzfus had built something that would never fade, never rot. Not just a barn, but a life that had been lived with purpose, care, and the quiet strength of a man who knew that sometimes the smallest acts of preparation can carry the greatest rewards. And so, as the seasons passed, his teachings continued to echo in the hearts of his children, his grandchildren, and all who had known him. His barn, though weathered with age, still stood firm, and the drain, channel once thought to be useless, continued to carry the water away year after year, protecting what had been built with love and wisdom. Eli's legacy would endure as solid as the barn he had built and the land he had loved.